Just wait for this internet. One more second. All right, great. Just wait for this internet. We should be good then. All right, perfect. Good evening and welcome to the New York Studio School's virtual evening lecture series. Tonight is very special and I'm pleased to be pleased to be presenting Albert Pinkham Ryder and a Century of American Art with William Agee, Christina Brophy, Elizabeth Broun, and Lois Dodd. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, taking the time to Zoom with us, and I would like to thank our panelists for being here on this, what is a rainy night in Brooklyn. Not sure where you are, but thank you so much. And I would also like to recognize that the New York Studio School evening lecture series is supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the Robert Lehman Foundation, and many individual contributors. The Studio School is deeply grateful for all of its public support of its programs. And please do consider making a donation to the school either during or after tonight's talk by clicking on the support button on our homepage at www.nyss.org and then just click the donate button. I will introduce our panelists, our very esteemed panelists. I'll try to be brief. I do want to mention that they are all contributors to this beautiful catalog for the exhibition that's coming up at the new Bedford Whaling Museum, set to open on June 24th. So you can find out information about purchasing the catalog and the exhibition through their website, which I'll put links into the chat once we get going. I also wanted to mention that they're doing a very interesting and exciting program where artists can actually log into the website and contribute images of their work and how they've been influenced by Ryder. So it's really exciting exhibition and very cool how they're expanding that to be very inclusive. Okay. Our speakers tonight are William Agee, is Professor Emeritus at Hunter College and former director of the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston and the Pasadena Art Museum. Is a curator at MoMA and the Whitney and has published extensively on modern art. He is currently working on a book for Rizzoli called Close Readings, Max Weber and American Cubism. Christina Connett Brophy is the former Douglas and Cynthia Crocker Endowed Chair for the Chief Curator at the New Bedford Whaling Museum and the lead curator of A Wild Note of Longing, Albert Pinkham Ryder and a Century of American Art, which again is opening June 24th. She has curated over 30 exhibitions working with such institutions as the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Consulate General of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and MFA Boston, to name a few. She has also worked extensively with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and others on developing exhibitions and programs on whale conservation and ocean health. She's lectured extensively in Europe, Russia, the Middle East, and the US on cartography, visual arts, maritime history, and other topics. And recently, as of December 2020, Christina has taken on a new role as Senior Director of Museum Galleries at the Mystic Seaport Museum in Mystic, Connecticut, and continues to be a guest curator of the upcoming Ryder exhibition in New Bedford. Elizabeth Broun is the Visual Arts Advisor at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts since 2018. She serves on the board of directors of the Henry Luce Foundation, the Irving Penn Foundation, and the Olana Partnership for Frederick Church's historic home in the Hudson River Valley. Her scholarly work has been in American art with special expertise on the work of Albert Pinkham Ryder, late 19th century and 20th century art and contemporary art. From 1989 through 2016, Dr. Broun was director of the Smithsonian Smithsonian American Art Museum, where she's now Director Emerita. She was born in Kansas City, earned her degrees in art history from the University of Kansas, and currently resides in Bethesda, Maryland. And last but not least is the painter on tonight's panel, Lois Dodd. Lois studied at the Cooper Union in the late 1940s and was a founding member of the Tanager Gallery. Dodd is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters and the National Academy, and her work has been the subject of over 51 person exhibitions. In 2012, the Kemper Museum of Contemporary Art organized a retrospective of Lois's work, which traveled to the Portland Museum of Art in Maine, and she is represented by Alexander Gallery in New York. And you can see some of her work right now on their website, where they have a viewing room, a virtual viewing room. And with that, I just want to say again that this is a really special night for us. I think Albert Pinkham Ryder is one of the good ghosts of the New York Studio School, and we're very, very excited to have him joining us. So please join me in welcoming our panel of special guests.
Thank you.
So, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Bill, do you want to start us off?
Sure. This is really a landmark exhibition. Ryder has been one of our greatest artists, and I think everybody knows that, but he's been hard to see, and since Elizabeth Broun's seminal exhibition and catalog of 1990, there's been very little said about him. I'd always been interested in his work, so I was happy to take on the task of getting into what is Ryder's legacy. In a brief word, it is vast, far vaster than I ever thought. I had first been interested in this topic by Pollock's famous comment that the only American master that interested him was Albert Pinkham Ryder. And those connections are very direct that we can look at in a minute. I had also then found a comment that Hans Hofmann had made when he first arrived in this country in 1930. He reportedly went to the Met and spent basically 2 days in there. When they came out, they asked him, friends asked him, well, what did you like best? And he said, Albert Pinkham Ryder. And they asked him why, and he said, the fullness of the color. Well, that really gets right to it. So those were my initial contacts, and then I began to get into it, and I discovered artist after artist who clearly related to and took quite a bit from Ryder. He was famous in his own day, of course, famous by the 1880s. He was revered in the early 20th century. He was the guest of honor, as it were, with a large installation of works at the 1913 Armory Show. And artists all through the teens, like Hartley and Arthur Dove into the 20s, were deeply impressed and taken by Ryder. And that has come right down to the present day in ways that I was not aware of. So much of this has been an enormous and fascinating voyage for me. A friend of mine, an artist, always said that art is about self-discovery. So this project has certainly been that. Now, one of the distinct pleasures for us all now is to have an artist whose work parallels and will remind us of Albert Pinkham Ryder. And that is Lois Dodd, whose work I've known for a long time. She's now a national treasure, no doubt, and part of a great American tradition of landscape painting that, of course, goes back well into the 19th century. So I'd like to, we want to do honor to Lois Dodd. She is such a good painting, is such a rich painter. So I'd like to show a few of the works that are in the book and that will be in the show opening in June. Could we have the next slide? Yes, here's a cloud formation. Of course, this is oil on aluminum flashing. They're very small, like Ryder's work. Ryder's work is so small, sometimes it seems to get lost. Lois, as we go along, I'd like you to comment on the works and maybe tell us a little bit of what Albert Ryder has meant to you.
What Ryder's work means to me. I'm not so sure, that I've contemplated Ryder that much, really. But he is definitely a kindred spirit. The things that I do that are possibly more felt and resonate for people more strongly, maybe those paintings that do have some connection to people from the work of Ryder. But the thing that you have on the screen is basically I'm working from life. And this particular scene was something I saw at night when I went outside and looked up at the sky. So now Ryder's work is more imaginative than mine in many, because I can't really embroider on reality. So I'm telling you that this little cloud formation is reality. It's what I saw. It's just like that. And which is true of the stuff I do that may or may not look more romantic. I mean, a Ryder we think of as a very romantic painter, which is not the way I feel about my own work. So it's interesting to hear what Bill says about Ryder, all of that. And I'm interested in what the rest of you have to say as well.
Here's
this is, it's a tiny flashing, and I went out one night, looked at the sky, and there it was. The things that I do of the sky are naturally mostly summer paintings. When I can go out at about 9 o'clock or 8:30 or 9, look at the sky and see something fantastic. And what I have to tell you is that when you see something like that, you have to immediately try to put it down, because if you wait until 10 o'clock, it's been erased, it's gone, it's not coming back. And there are these amazing phenomena that seem to occur in the early but darkness of the sky in a summer night that have been quite an inspiration for me. And also what I love about it is that for me, the fact that it's going to last about half an hour gives me the gumption and the drive to get it down as fast as possible. So I feel more like I'm reporting on weather events than that I'm relating to some mystical inner force, you know?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Next slide, please.
It is too, you know, it went out on here, this is what was going on in the sky.
Yeah.
And so I
I might
think
jump in to say that Ryder himself took many, many long walks all through New York at night looking at the sky. It was his
Right.
favorite thing to do. People thought he was a bum because he looked so disreputable,
yes,
but he would
yes,
spend hours wandering around on the streets of New York just to observe the sky and the moon.
yeah, right. I don't know how he did that in Manhattan, to tell you the truth. I find that I'm doing it here in Maine much more easily. Wandering around the sky, wandering around Manhattan at night is not so easy done. It's just, you feel the hazard of the fact that you're out wandering in the street and who knows what the heck is going to happen. Of course, in his day, I'm sure it was a lot quieter wandering around in the street. Maybe there was
And they didn't have so many electric lights.
right, there weren't electric lights, there weren't automobiles. It was quite a different world, which you see in the paintings, which is why they're so beautiful, really. Yeah.
I really love to think of your work of the sky paintings that we've been looking at as part of a great American tradition that goes back into the 19th century, of course, comes up through Arthur Dove, and now has been carried on in your work in your own personal way. Next slide, please. Here's another image of the sky, of the moon, and of course, the moon is so closely related to Ryder. So whenever we see a full moon, it has become called the Ryder moon. But there's this
Right.
fascination with this larger order of the universe that makes your paintings and Ryder's so large. The Ryder's paintings, as we know, are often tiny, but they have this huge internal scale, which your work certainly does too.
It also has a kind of ecstatic quality. You know, it's not just observation of nature. It's a vision.
Well, I myself, I think of it as just observational. You know, that's what I'm doing, but
yeah,
it hooks up with historic things, which is nice, which is very rewarding. Let's put it that way.
Okay, next slide, please.
Huh?
Next slide.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, here we have another one
Yeah.
of your
You
research.
can see that they're rapidly done, because you can also see that what was happening with the moon is going to last about 5 minutes, and then the whole thing is going to be a different arrangement. And actually, I just find that if I'm being pushed like that, either my eyesight is sharper and my hand is faster, and maybe my feelings are more, the whole thing is more forward, so to speak. Everything is more on the surface, what I'm feeling, what I'm seeing, and the way I'm putting it down. So I think that comes across.
Yeah.
Final result.
So Lois, do you actually paint outside while you're seeing this, or do you observe it and then go into the studio and do it quickly?
I've done both, but these little tiny ones are mostly outside, except that if it's really a dark night, you can't see what you're doing. So you rush out, paint in the dark, like it's a little bit like painting with your hands. Go back in, look at it in the light, see what you've got, go back out, put a little more on. So it's a back and forth process, except that the moon is, some nights the moon is so bright that you really can see exactly what you're doing the whole time. So mostly you do have full moons, and that's probably why it's brighter, lighter, and easier to see what you're doing. at night when the moon is full.
And Ms. Dodd, I love that they're so small. I just want everyone to notice they're 5 by 7 inches, and you're painting these enormous skyscapes on these very diminutive sizes, which also reminds me a lot of Ryder. So I do find that to be so elegant and intimate, and they're just,
Yeah.
I love the scale.
A few of them I tried blowing up and did, but the real satisfaction is in the ones that are directly out there, that I'm out there doing.
Okay, next slide, please. Well, thank you very much, Lois. And
Yes. Thank you.
and just again, I'm so glad that you could join us. And so
And feel free to jump in for
Yeah.
the rest of this too.
Anybody, if you want to jump in, please do. Here's a wonderful Hoffman of, as you can see, 1958, called Oceanic, and it has that turbulence of and the thickness of the color of Ryder. As Lois, as you said, your work is done very quickly. That's certainly the opposite of Ryder, who Betsy can expound on this, who just worked and reworked and reworked his surfaces until the paint builds up, so there's a material density to it, and you feel as if the light is built in to the paint. And some of Ryder's famous paintings, of course, the agitation, such as most famously the Jonah painting, you see also now in a lot of abstract expressionist work. So Pollock was not the only artist who was interested in Ryder. Next slide, please.
Before you leave Hans Hofmann, I want to jump in and say he gave a lecture about Ryder in which he said he was one of the cosmic creators.
Cosmic creators, right. Thanks, Betsy.
And I only wish this painting were in the show. Alas, it is not, but it certainly says a lot about Ryder.
Yeah.
Good plug, Betsy.
And then just a brief sampling of some of the things that we found. Next slide, please.
How large is this canvas? I was wondering how large that.
If we could go back, Sam, it's a good size. I'd say it's about 50 or 60 by 36, something like that.
Yeah.
It's a good large size painting. Yeah.
Yes.
It's in the Hirshhorn.
Mhm.
And then the next slide. Here's the painting that's Curfew Hour that we were discussing before.
Yeah.
This is one of the paintings by Ryder on the left that's in the Met storage. You can go see it. Is considered a wreck now because of the changes to the surface and the things that Ryder famously did to his surface, including running a hot poker over the surface. For Ryder, well, when you're different, you're always called eccentric. But Ryder was often considered a kind of sloppy painter, uncaring about his tools and materials, and just letting things go in this careless and sloppy way. But I don't believe that's true. Ryder loved to experiment with paint. Remember, he's working in the late 19th, early 20th century, and he's part, as I see it, of a great move in America toward inventing new things and working in new ways. And Ryder famously also said that he wanted to make his pictures look not so painty, something else, something in their own right, just more than a depiction of a natural scene. So he's worked with this, and I think that he would be very proud of the results now. because it really is one of the first instances of what becomes an important innovation in modern art, and that is of the disrupted, disjointed, broken surfaces, as perhaps most famously, most early on, the work of Robert Rauschenberg in the early 1950s. And I think that Ryder is really not, far from being eccentric, is part of a broad wave of American pragmatism in which you try something else, see what works, be not afraid to open up and to try new things. So if we could have the next slides, please.
I also wanted to just jump in and
of course.
Just remind people that you can put questions in the Q&A and we'll try and take them during the talk. And there is a question here from Susan Darwin. She's asking how many writers are in the show.
I just answered that and said roughly 25.
And
it includes many of the masters. It includes Jonah and the Flying Dutchman and Lord Ulan's Daughter and Gayhead, and some of the very finest ones are in the show.
Yeah, everyone should remember that that Betsy was director at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and was responsible for that installation of the writers, and they have been very generous, and I think it's out of respect and honor for Betsy and what she has meant to American scholarship and especially to Ryder. So
it's also a recognition that they have the finest collection by far. They have about 16 or 17 original Ryder paintings, and he only did about 160 altogether.
If any of you have been to the Smithsonian American Art Ryder room, where basically that entire room is coming to New Bedford, which is really exciting. And they honored that loan even after COVID, which was incredibly generous. And that's due to Betsy 100%. So
it's interesting to think of Pollock, who evidently was very close to Thomas Hart Benton.
Yeah,
to think of Benton and Ryder, I mean.
We have a wonderful Benton coming from the Hirshhorn that will pair up nicely with this Pollock.
Yeah, this is
similar subject.
I found this little painting up in New Britain, in the New Britain Museum, which is just up the road from me. And I'm now living in Chester, Connecticut. And it clearly shows that Pollock was early on looking at Ryder and knew the work clearly. And the thing was that about it's that internal energy of Ryder in his highly active, explosive paintings is an energy that comes in through the paint, and it's this kind of organic style, this kind of explosive quality we get is something that runs through a lot of American art. So this will be in the exhibition.
It's worth noting that this is actually a gift to the New Britain Museum from Thomas Hart Benton's son.
Yes, yeah. They were very close, of course, in the 1930s. Benton was one of Pollock's teachers. Right. I don't think that Pollock ever gave proper credit to Benton for what he did for him, but that's another matter.
I do like that this scale and media is very similar to Miss Dodd's as well, which I
yes, exactly. And then next slide, please. Yeah, well, here's Pollock in the mid-40s in one of his early masterpieces, The My Moon Woman. We all know what the legends of the moon and how the moon affects us. And here, which continues a Ryder theme, of course. And the Pollock, this is really a great painting. I still don't think we know the writers of the Pollocks of the early 40s well enough. But again, you can see this internal Baroque energy that is embodied in the paint that seems to really get to something deep, mystical, and far away. I wish this painting could be in the show, but apparently not. This work also relates to the work of Richard Pousset Dart, a really good artist who should be better known. Actually, his father, Nathaniel Pousset Dart, was really struck by Ryder too, and there is an abstraction by him that we will have in the exhibition. Next slide, please. Well, here's another aspect of Ryder, is that stillness, that absolutely frozen in eternity kind of stillness in the Weir's Orchard painting that is coming from the Wadsworth, also just up the road from me now. And and this is a painting by Wolf Kahn, the late Wolf Kahn, who just recently passed, who I visited with and got to know. And the first time I mentioned Ryder to him, he just looked at me and said, he's one of my gods. And he's not the only painter who has said that to me. This kind of wonderful stillness, something that seems almost frozen in time, something that's beyond time. It's another aspect of Ryder. I would tell you a story about how I really got on to how deep Ryder's legacy was. I went up to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston to see a painting, Constance, it's in the book. And on my way up to the American Gallery, there was a staff member, Emily Auchincloss, who was giving she's in the education department, she was giving a demonstration of Northern Renaissance painting. And I started talking to her, and I don't know what struck me, but I just turned to her and I said, well, this is interesting, but tell me how you feel about Albert Pinkham Ryder. And she just stopped and looked at me with her mouth half open and saying, as if I were some kind of magician, she said exactly the same thing. He's a god to me. And she is not well known. I think she will be. But she has talked about how Ryder gives permission to be personal. Something that's really your own. It can be small scale or it doesn't make any difference, but it's something personal and private. And when you look at Ryder, I find it's just you and Ryder. There's nobody else, nothing else. So that really put me on to understanding how many younger artists have still continued to look hard at Ryder's work. So next slide, please. And here's work by Bill Jensen, who has been an eloquent spokesman for Ryder. This is a room full of writers, and I believe this was done after he had seen Betsy's installation at the Smithsonian back in the late 80s. And you can see how Jensen loves that in the same way that Ryder did, that same deep, quiet but convulsive kind of painterly quality in which the paint has this physical presence, just as Ryder does. And Jensen is spoken and written very well on Ryder. And Ryder still pervades his more recent work. Betsy, did Right, did Jensen ever talk to you about this painting? You had it in your book too.
This was done after we reinstalled the museum and we created a room just for Ryder paintings, and he came and saw it. You can kind of barely discern there are kind of rectangular shapes in this that represent the paintings. He also, in addition to the surging energy and the rhythms that you point out, he came closer than many in terms of the color. You know, Ryder was hailed as an enormously impressive colorist. And today people don't see that because it was a different palette then. But he really gets it. He understands Ryder's colorism as well as any.
Yeah, right. And absolutely.
And notice it's dedicated to Ronnie Bladen.
Yes.
Who was another big fan.
Yeah, Bladen was a huge fan of Ryder's, and that apparently came from working with Clifford Still out on the West Coast in San Francisco in the 40s and early 50s. Clifford Still, thick color, that surging forces within his paintings. I think we'll see one in a minute. And the buildup of the paint. And as we've said, Ryder built up the paint, and Ryder and Bladen and his close friend Al Held were doing the same thing. Now, apparently what happened was, this is according to Jensen, that Bladen and Held got into a contest to see how thick they could build a painting and still have the canvas hold together. Well, Bladen made a painting that was so thick that he had to put a 2x4 across the front of the surface to keep the paint in place. And
across the front or across the back?
Pardon? Across the front.
Putting it across the front so he could continue to work without getting his hands in the paint.
Yeah, and also just to make sure the painting, the surface stayed attached.
Yeah.
Now, my own idea is that 2x4. So when Bladen came to look at it a couple of days later, he liked the 2x4 across it. And there we have the thick painting evolving now into an early minimalist work.
Yeah.
So that was very interesting. Next painting, please. Next slide, please. Well, that's it. But this is just a sample of it. It's just we should have seen it. Betsy did and outlined it, but we just never fully begun to until now to really see the extent of the impact he's had on painting and the attitude of artists. So, Christina, this is your watch now.
Well, thank you, Bill. And I again encourage everyone watching, listening, seeing this later on a feature tape to get the book and read Bill's chapter about these artists, because there are many more illustrations and many stories that Bill tells so eloquently. Really, one of the greatest things we're trying to accomplish in the exhibition is why Ryder still matters. It's been a century of American modern art that he has greatly informed, and he continues to resonate. So that's really one of the biggest things we're trying to exercise here. So thanks to Bill, that's been possible. I'm going to take a very brief time because I think that the true, you have the world-renowned scholar, the greatest scholar of Albert Pinkham Ryder coming after me, and I think that's probably a bit more in line with what you'd like to see. So I'm going to contextualize Ryder in a question that maybe has occurred to some of you at this point, is why in the world is the New Bedford Whaling Museum putting on an exhibition of Albert Pinkham Ryder? So just and talk a bit about the first part of his life, which was spent in New Bedford. He was from New Bedford and did not leave to New York until he was around 20 years old. But I wanted to give you some context of the environment in which he spent those young years. I do have this quote from Simon Schama that I just love, because I feel like I'm not an artist myself. I was a pretend artist for many years, and I love making art and I'm fascinated with it. I do feel like our experiences in life inform, even from early years, inform how we look at the world and how we think about things and how we reminisce about smells and textures and environment. And I think that the really interesting, gritty, fabulous small city of New Bedford in Massachusetts is one of those places you just, if you've been there, it never leaves you. It's a really incredibly extraordinary place. And in Ryder's time, it was particularly important. But before it can ever be a repose for the senses, landscape is the work of the mind. Its scenery is built up as much from strata of memory as layers of rock, from Simon Schama. This is what New Bedford looked like when Ryder was just a wee lad of one. It was the year of the opening of the Grand Panorama of a whaling voyage around the world. He was born at a time of the World's Fairs, of grand panoramas, of cycloramas, of great paintings, and I'll show you some of those in a second. But New Bedford at this time had 329 whaling ships, and the income from that industry was over $60 million per year in today's dollars, and it employed 10,000 people. So twice in its history, New Bedford was the highest income per capita in the country. It was the fourth biggest maritime port in the country besides Boston, New York, and New Orleans. So this is what the waterfront looked like. This is a 1,275 foot long moving panorama. It's 8.5 feet high, and it's in the New Bedford Whaling Museum collection. But it's a really fabulous way, a portrait to really understand what this bustling waterfront must have looked like, must have smelled like, must have been this extraordinary time in the city to be part of. And soon thereafter, only a couple of years later, petroleum was discovered in Pennsylvania, which really tanked a lot of the whaling market. And 37 ships were lost in the Stone Fleet in the Civil War in '61, and 30 more in the Arctic ice in the '70s. And you can see very barely on the right side, this little tiny mill. It's a mill with a chimney sort of chugging along on the right side. And that's the first mill built in New Bedford in 1841. It really wasn't until the 1870s that the manufacturing era took over. And that's, you know, when Ryder left in the 60s, the city was just at this point of transition. And I love the eloquence of Ryder being this transitory artist between the ancient and modern, between European and American, but, you know, from the first real early American modernist master. And this is sort of beautifully illustrated in this great transitory stage of New Bedford, which is right when the Ryder family left and went down to New York. Next slide. Also, when Ryder was 11, Albert Bierstadt, who's one of a very nationalistic artist who was also from New Bedford, he came from Germany with his family when he was 3 and grew up for many years in New Bedford, then went back to school in Dusseldorf, which is very much the style that he ended up portraying, this grand, crisp, sort of nationalistic, huge scale paintings. He came back to New Bedford in 1858 and did this exhibition. And the catalog is at the end of the book, but it's really a fascinating extra story that I fantasize that Ryder came to see the exhibition when he was 11. I hope so. But there are 150 works by 70 artists from America and also from Europe that Bierstadt had met abroad or met in New York and brought them into this exhibition. He was trying to put New Bedford on the map. This is, again, like 1 year after those numbers I just mentioned. It was a very wealthy city with extraordinary patronage for artists to travel and to buy works for their offices and for their homes. And it was a time when he was really trying to capitalize on the burgeoning art market, and shows like this were happening in Philadelphia and Boston and elsewhere. So he's trying to mirror that, but this show included Thomas Cole, George Inness, who, you know, earlier works that are a little less Ryder-esque, but certainly had connections later on. Thomas Selly, Asher B. Durand, Frederick Edwin Church, Kensett, Van Beest, and many others. One woman artist, and Bierstadt made sure to include 15 of his own. But this was happening in Ryder's time. So he was young, yet this was this sort of sentiment. This is the culture of New Bedford, was really an artistic hotspot of its age. Next slide, please, Sam. This is William Bradford's work called Sealers Crushed by Icebergs. It's also in the Whaling Museum collection from 1866. And like Bierstadt and Church and Cole, this was part of that great painting era. These were enormous scale that, like a World's Fair event or a panorama, you would pay a certain amount of money and draw back the curtain, and then you get to see this big painting. It's so opposite of what Ryder was doing later on. I just find this sort of fascinating that he basically had very little to do with a lot of these artists that he was exposed to. Bradford did spend time in New York at 10th Street Studios. Ryder was probably around that time as well. He would have met a lot of the artists that certainly were associated with Ryder, but this painting is enormous and it's very powerful. Like the panorama, I didn't mention, but the artists who did the panorama one of them did do a whaling voyage around the world. So it had that era of authenticity, which was very popular with panoramas, that realness, that sort of fantasy, the armchair sailor. And Bradford certainly had that as well, having done 6 Arctic voyages of his own. He was also in the Bierstadt exhibition, and I can't imagine Ryder wasn't familiar with his work, as he was very prolific in New Bedford as well as in New York. But for Ryder, had that compressed intimacy, that much more internal rather than external. And Bradford was all about show and pomp and sort of the showmanship work, which is so incredibly different than Ryder. Next slide, Sam. Another local artist is Robert Swain Gifford, who Ryder did meet in Europe. They did both do Orientalist themes and sort of followed that same trajectory of traveling around and doing these beautiful works based on sort of the fantasy, the exoticism, the colors of the Orient. And they certainly knew each other, but how well, I don't know. But this is an artist I think sort of starts to kind of get closer to Ryder, but still, with the sort of more brushwork. These figures are very diminutive and more as a matter of sort of decoration rather than a focus. And we do have at least 2 Orientalist works by Ryder in the exhibition, which are beautiful and quite small. Next slide, Sam. And Dwight Tryon, you may not know, is also from New Bedford area. He painted this beautiful piece that's in the collection called After a Storm, New Bedford Harbor. And while tonalist and kind of getting there, this is still very much a location that's very identifiable. And one of the things I find so fascinating with Ryder, there's so few paintings that actually describe a specific geographic location, like Weir's Orchard, which was so near and dear to his heart, and Gayhead, which you'll see later, that's from the Phillips collection, which is very close to New Bedford and Martha's Vineyard, if you're not familiar with it. Sam, that's our next one. This is another piece. This is a piece of George Inness that's later than the one that would have been in the Bierstadt exhibition. I feel like that one probably was more Barbizon in nature. We don't know which one it was exactly. If you look at the catalog, it says something like landscape or something. We have no idea what it actually was. But his work at that time was not quite this spiritual yet, but it's sort of, I like the idea that somehow George Inness got into young Ryder's head. But looking at the landscape as being more personal in nature, more spiritual, and to me, that's more the Ryder. I feel like that and Betsy will speak on this for sure momentarily, but that it's a suggestion of reality. It's not an identifiable space. It's an emotive response. It's this sense of a place rather than a definition of the place. Sam? Thank you. And then this is the landscape that actually belongs to the New Bedford Whaling Museum. I say we, I'm not there anymore, but the Whaling Museum has one painting by Ryder, and it's in this little, beautiful, very early landscape, which was authenticated by none other than Betsy Broun herself. It's very small. It's an interesting Ryder in that it sort of soaks into the canvas. It has no surface texture. So kind of what Bill was talking with Ryder's later work, this is a beautiful kind of almost luminescent, very monochromatic, very delicate piece that I just feel, to me, in many ways, if you've been to the South Dartmouth, sort of Southern New England, Southern Massachusetts area, this is that emotive, that spiritual, that sort of essence of the location. I have no idea where this painting was actually created. It could have been Connecticut, it could have been somewhere in New York State, but to me, it really evokes that feeling of South Dartmouth. The colors, the sort of marshiness, and it's so Ryder-esque to me. I just am absolutely in love with it. And just quickly, I wanted to mention a quick story about this. It came to the Whaling Museum in 2004. It was up for auction, and Lawrence Salander bought it when one of our trustees and chair of our collections committee, Mrs. Levin, was down there in New York ready to bid on it, and it got snapped up by Salander. So what does Mrs. Levin and her husband, Dr. Levin, do but make an appointment at Salander's gallery and talk him into selling it back to the Whaling Museum for the same price he paid for it, put it in their trunk and drove it to New Bedford. which I absolutely love. And so she's really responsible for having this in the collection in many ways. And she happens to also collect Lois Dodd paintings, which I think is a wonderful connection. And I think she's on the line tonight. So thank you, Fran, for that. So I'm going to end there and let Betsy get going on her talk. But I, again, want to please encourage you to come up to New Bedford. It's actually where Ryder is buried. In fact, he's actually still in the city. And this exhibition brings him home again. So please come up and see it. I'm happy to take questions after the talk.
So I have 8 Ryder slides if you count this one. And rather than talk at length, I'm sort of eager to get onto the questions. So why don't I just flip through these really quickly with a line or two about each, and then we can have questions. This, I might just say, it shows that from the very beginning, Ryder was playing with the medium. He was always interested in materials. He was interested in paint and in media. And this actually, the reason the canvas looks stained, he was probably thinning his paints with alcohol. And there are some glazes on the surface, but from the very, very first pictures, he is working to change the way the painting worked and to make it more of an object. That is why modern artists, I think, revere him. He was really the first modernist. Can I have the next? This is Gayhead. This is the one where he's looking across the Menenche Blight to New Bedford over in the distance. You know, he's already abstracting the landscape. It's sort of diagonal layers, and it's almost as if he's putting little diagonal layers in place, stacking up towards the horizon to distance himself from his own childhood. He loved that landscape. Could I see the next, please?
Betsy, there's a question that came.
Okay.
From Mary Pat. She's asking, has Ryder's color palette changed over time because of his materials and use of varnish? Do we have an accurate picture of his palette?
So the short answer is yes and yes. His palette has changed because a lot of the oils and the varnish have darkened. And so a lot of things are darker than they would have been before. He did not apparently use bitumen, which is one of many errors in the Ryder legend. In fact, of everything you know about Ryder, probably 90% of it is wrong because there were so many false legends that came to mind. We did do an entire technical study for 5 years on a large group of Ryder paintings in the Smithsonian and other museums. We have a very clear palette for Ryder. He used a Prussian blue. He used this sort of yellow that you see here, a kind of an earthy yellow. He used a kind of a raw umber or reddish umber. He used a very dense white creamy pigment that often had a lot of lumpy impurities in it. But it was a palette that was restricted to 5 or 6 different colors. And then he just put them on in ways that was unique and original and interesting, where he would work one color into another. He would use stiff brushes to sort of score into the dense paint with a different color, or he would reveal an underpaint. But it wasn't because the palette was so huge. It was a very limited palette used very creatively. This is a really early picture. It just shows him so free in the approach. He did not like detail. He wanted to capture nature in its essence. He was always looking to sort of, penetrate to the mystery of nature. Could I have the next? Sam, thank you. This is a favorite of mine. It's in Brooklyn. It shows a shepherdess. So he did many, many, many pictures of these innocent young girls, innocent women. They were shepherdesses, or they were maidens, or they were out of Elizabethan poetry, but he was sort of fixated on how beautiful these young women were. She's holding panpipes in her hand, and she's wearing a kind of Elizabethan costume. So already we see him moving beyond just nature into sort of the realm of lyric poetry. And increasingly over his lifetime, he sort of withdrew into what he thought of as the land of the muses. The other reason I love this picture, very limited palette again, it's painted over a substrate of gold leaf. So when we talk about Ryder wanting to experiment with the medium, one of his goals was to make his colors more gem-like and to have them glow more so that they wouldn't look so opaque. And he thought that by painting light glazes over gold leaf, the light would penetrate down to the gold and bounce back. And so he did a number of decorative panels this way. And this is a very small, beautiful little painting he did with that very unusual technique. Only one or two other artists, people like John Lafarge, had tried it, but not many. Could I have the next? So this one and the two that follow are what I think of as the magnum opus pictures. This is a Scottish poem from Thomas Campbell about two lovers trying to flee in a boat in order to escape the wrath of the girl's father. But what you see is this explosive energy, this sort of zigzag wave that is working its way up the center of the composition and cresting out and overturning the boat. These lovers died, by the way. They were capsized and died. And then the huge rock jets out at the horizon. And then finally, all the energy escapes through the clouds in the sky. And it's what Ryder did best. This is in the Smithsonian American Art Museum. If you go to the website that they have and look at the writers, they have a phenomenal zoom feature. You can get your eye so far down into these waves, you can really see the method he used to paint and to layer in color after color. And you can see how he achieved his effects. Actually, you can see it more clearly on the website than in person. Could I have the next? Flying Dutchman, another one of the great ones. So here it's a kind of centrifugal, it's like the energy is all orbiting around the moon. It's sort of gravitationally pulled in a motion that is orbiting around the moon. And of course, like so many of Ryder's mature late things, it's a story of damnation and revenge and redemption. So, the Flying Dutchman had blasphemed against the true cross, and anyway, his son had to redeem him after years of sailing the oceans. So it's all about what you see in the foreground, this sort of foundering ship with the tattered sail, and then the ghostly galleon at the horizon. It's Ryder at his most ecstatic and his most sort of intuitive. No one else could do this. Even Ryder couldn't do it after a while. It was a brief period. Can I have the next, please? Okay, this is the great one. This is Jonah. Here he combines everything. You've got the zigzag compositional explosion going through the center. You've got the sort of centrifugal motion with the great fish on the right and the boat coming up on the left. And then you've got this claustrophobic feeling. Here is this God the Father, and he's really a judging God. I mean, he's kind of a damning God. He's not necessarily, we're not sure he's into redemption yet, but he spreads his wings over the horizon and really prevents those energies from escaping. So before they escape through the clouds up to the top, but now they're really confined, and you sort of feel the compression and the feeling of being almost trapped. And indeed, at this point in his life, Ryder did feel sort of abandoned by his friends. He felt he was not going to find love. He felt that he was in effect foundering. He was not master of his own life. And this painting is very much an emblem of his sort of state of mind, but also, whenever he painted these pictures, there was kind of an existential portrayal of reality, of the reality that he felt was life. Can I have the next? This is just a fairly late one. As he got older, he was more and more valued by the modernists for his two-dimensionality. And to some extent, that's because the painting's darkened. This one is darkened considerably. You can barely make out the boat in the cove and the landscape behind it. But that sense of design, that arabesque form, that sense of reduction is what appealed mostly to the modernists. So with that brief, we could take a few questions. I see there's one about Albert York and Albert Pinkham Ryder. Absolutely, Albert York revered Ryder. And there is a great deal of similarity, both in terms of some of their eccentricities as well as their paintings. What artists inspired Ryder? Well, his work was always highly personal, but he looked at everything. He was very inspired by Millet. He was very inspired by other Barbizon artists. He loved Corot. That little shepherdess girl is probably inspired by Corot. He traveled 4 times to Europe. He went to a number of museums. He was not in any way the ignorant, naive artist that he came down to us as. He He was in a circle in New York with all the avant-garde painters of his day, of the 1880s. He was very much a friend of Haslam and Weir and Twatman and all of the impressionists of the 1880s, although he himself was never an impressionist. So what else have we got? What other questions?
Well, thank you all. Should I stop sharing the screen, or do you want to?
Or you could just go back through some. I see Eric Gibson asked why Ryder is a relatively obscure figure. I think he got overtaken in part by the heroism of abstract expressionism, which created a taste in America for heroic overscale pictures. And with that taste, when academics went back to the 19th century, they began to value the big machine paintings of Frederick Church or Albert Bierstadt, Jerusalem or Heart of the Andes, and these little tiny writers began to seem sort of minor. Yes, they were deteriorating. There also were forgery problems. Already by 1912, the forgeries were starting to appear. So that the market became very fearful about Ryder, very reluctant to trade in Ryder, very hard to get attributions. Lloyd Goodrich kind of sorted out the sheep from the goats, but he was very discreet about publishing that. So a lot of paintings were circulating that weren't probably right. So anyway, the marketplace abandoned Ryder and academia largely abandoned Ryder, but the artist never did, as Bill has so eloquently shown us.
Betsy, if I might, the museums haven't known what to do with Ryder.
That's right.
And so when I went off on exploring and all, of course, the Met only hangs one, and you have to go through those, as you say, enormous machine paintings to try to find it. I got lost trying to find it, and I finally had to ask a guard, and she knew where it was. She said, well, just keep going until you can't go any further, and then turn left, and it will be down at the end of, and this was a dead end. It was just sat there. It's one of the sailboat pictures. It's just there by itself. But
well, the Met has two of the paintings that were most influential. So they have Moonlight Marine, and I'm forgetting right now the name of the other one, but they have two of the paintings. Ironically, they're both late pictures, heavily overpainted by Ryder. He worked on them a long time. He was reluctant to let them go. I don't think they're the great writers, but they were very influential. The Met used to celebrate them and had them on view all through the 20s and 30s and 40s. And they had, if he was revered by a lot of modern artists, it's partly because of those paintings in the Met. But today, they'd rather show their giant sergeant portraits.
Yeah. Also, in Boston, when I was looking at the Ryder there, it was in a room with Homers and Akins, and the docent came by. The curator, Emily, was doing a little session in the corner with about 10 people. It's fascinating. The docent came through with her group, talked a lot about Akins and Homer, and walked right by the Ryder. Of course, we were blocking it, but clearly Ryder was not on her radar.
So Lloyd Goodrich he considered the great trio of American 19th century artists to be Homer, Akins, and Ryder. And he portrayed Homer as a sort of hard-nosed realist who was struggling to paint the sea in a manly way. And he made Akins into the sort of emblem of American science and ingenuity and refinement and sort of a melancholy. And Ryder then was the romantic. He was so Akins kind of had, Lloyd Goodrich had them sort of pigeonholed according to what they were. Yeah. Somehow the realism of Akins and Homer was more durable than the romance and mysticism and spirituality of Ryder. He just didn't survive quite as well as Homer and Akins.
Yeah, it's accessible, I think, to a general audience at a certain point in time. And even with the exhibition, trying to get people to kind of sit and look and spend time with Ryder and allow him in is going to be, a big focus.
But,
hey, you got to love Homer and Akins too. I'm not putting them down, but they're a little easier to access.
it's not to take anything away from them, but they're missing a great artist.
Right.
Betsy, some of your stories about one museum, they didn't know what to do with their writers, so they deaccessioned them. And
there's a happy ending to that. We may have reversed that. So.
Oh, really? Good. You've been
Yeah.
at work on it. That's great. There's another museum that I'm pretty sure they've lost their writer. Actually, they have two, and I don't think they can find them. I keep asking them and said, well, we're investigating. So
one thing we should highlight here, I see there's a comment in the chat that says, I want to mention that Lois was a fantastic professor for many years at Brooklyn College. As one of her students, I am lucky to have benefited from her teaching and her example of how to live a life staying true to one's vision. That is a very strong Ryder message also. Ryder always stayed true to his vision.
Yeah.
You know, he looked at everybody else's art, but he took only what inspired him.
And Betsy, I see there's a question from the New Bedford Whaling Museum president, Amanda McMullen. She wants to know why he preferred such small canvases and sizes that you might.
Well, so for him, it was intimacy. You know, it was not, he was not a shouter or a heroic kind of painter. It was to draw you in and to feel intimate and almost confidential and personal. He did, you know, when you get to Jonah, you've got a painting that's about 24 by 36 inches. That's a kind of respectable easel-sized picture. But a lot of those small landscapes are very intimate, personal, little glimpses of nature.
Right. You remember Rothko said that he painted large in order to be intimate, but you can be, because you're lost in it, but you can also be intimate with very small pictures. And
the small pictures, you have to be drawn right in to look at.
You have to be, and that's it. And it's just, as I said before, it's just you and Ryder.
Yeah,
and that's it.
It's some way more mental. Ryder lived very much in a kind of realm of poetry and the imagination. He, you know, he became somewhat reclusive later in life, although he wasn't initially. But, you know, for him, living with poets was, you know, he was hugely interested in Shakespeare and poetry and music and sort of the realm of the imagination. And for him, that was reality.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a question from the painter Lisa Jensen, which relates to this idea of small scale and presence and directed towards Lois. She says, I love Lois's description of her work as weather reports, but there is so much in her paintings with their dynamic rhythms and luminous color and light.
Yeah.
Could it be that the close observation and sense of a very specific moment in time is in itself mystical, being wholly present, etc.?
The answer is yes.
But that translates for Ryder too, right?
Yes.
I mean, in a different way.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes.
So I see 3 people have asked if Ryder was influenced by Turner. And the short answer to that is I have never found any reference of any type to anything having to do with Turner. Okay. You know, the sort of veils of color, and it was not his thing. And, you know, in a way, Turner was doing it because he thought it was a modern vision, but Ryder kind of wanted to recapture the antique vision. So I don't think Turner was, and it had an impact on him. No, Death on a Pale Horse is not in the exhibition, I'm sorry to say. What is the most difficult aspect of conserving Ryder paintings? Well, you know, the late ones, the really thick ones, you have to decide. You're either going to do something very invasive, which is contrary to today's conservation ethic, or you're going to just let them deteriorate. Now, Ryder was okay with that. He saw the painting as an organic thing, and he would say, consider the Venus de Milo. Even without a head or arms, she's still beautiful because a thing conceived in beauty will always be beautiful. So he didn't really care. He didn't really want his pictures conserved or touched, or, you know, he was willing to let them sort of live their life on their own. But if you want to keep them around for a while and you are willing to do it, you can aggressively treat a writer and try to save it.
I did think too, though, Betsy, at one point you and I talked about the viscosity of the surface. So unlike the Bladen picture, which we were looking at getting, it was sort of, you know, the conservation was too dire. But it seemed like to me from all the work on conservation with Ryder, they were more gooey to the surface. So they're
very, very heavy oils, a lot of oils. He loved, you know, he would sometimes when he was going to show a picture to someone, he would just pour oil over the surface of the picture and let it drain off so that it would saturate the colors and they would look very beautiful. He was definitely fond of oil.
Amy Brown Price is asking if there's any knowledge of Ryder drawing, or did he keep a journal or write at all?
There are a few drawings, and in fact, he's a better draftsman than people give him credit for. If you look at some of the early works, especially some of the early pastoral subjects with horses and sheep, and they're extremely well drawn. Even some of the muses that he did are very elegantly sketched and painted in paint. The verso of that near Litchfield canvas has a drawing of a horse on it that's extremely nicely done, beautifully foreshortened, very secure drawing. There are a few windmill subjects that he did in drawing. He didn't really, drawing was not a particular interest of his, and I'm not aware that he kept a notebook. There is, however, an extremely interesting pen sketch, a Flying Dutchman, that he did, and it's just all scribbling as if he's trying to get the effect that he got in paint. You know, there's nothing linear about it, even though he's doing it with pen and ink. It's all done in terms of color shapes and volumes. So, you know, he was a very capable artist. He just liked to play with the paint, and it led people to think that he was untutored or didn't understand how to do it. He, you know, he had access to all the great painters of his day. They were all his friends. So it isn't that he didn't know how to paint. He studied at the National Academy of Design. So it's a mistake to think he is, you know, just not tutored. The fact is, he was just very original and determined to do something different.
Yeah.
Were there any writers, or are there any writers, especially like during his lifetime or after he died, his paintings in Europe?
Such a good question. So his best dealer, the dealer he had until the dealer died in 1891, was Daniel Cottier. And he was from Glasgow. He was a stained glass maker. And Daniel Cottier, by 1878, which is early, he had a commercial gallery in Glasgow, in New York, and in Sydney, Australia. He also had lots of patrons in Montreal. So he had a kind of a nexus, a kind of a cluster of collectors, and he would sell the same paintings to each of these collectors. So partly it was a Scottish connection, you know, a lot of Scots who had emigrated from Scotland and Edinburgh and Glasgow to Montreal and also to New York. So there was a kind of a linear thread you can track. And so, for instance, Cottier would sell a lot of paintings by Monticelli, Adolphe Monticelli, who's not a painter much known today, but you find them in all the same places that you found Ryder paintings. So I've always imagined that the lost writers, the ones that we see mentioned in exhibition histories but can't find, I always think they're probably in Europe. I think they got sold into Scotland and then somehow disappeared. Unfortunately, Daniel Cottier's papers have never been found. So whatever sales records he might have had, those are all lost. If we could find them, I bet you the writers are there.
Someone's asking from YouTube if Lois, if you could just speak a little bit more on intimacy in painting.
Intimacy.
From a painter's perspective.
From a painter's perspective. I can't really.
No.
I mean,
why did you use aluminum flashing?
Oh, I used it because it's available at the lumber yard, very cheap. You can get a bundle of 50 for a couple bucks. And actually, I got the tip from a student I visited at Vermont Studio Center one year for a while. And the student there was painting on these small flashings. So I asked her what they were and where she got them. And it turned out that they were available at any lumber yard. And so I got some and tried them. Then I became hooked on them. They really are handy and good for, to do something quickly in a small space or whatever. So that's where the flashings came from.
I think
Originally.
Man Ray did some early paintings on roofing metal.
Same stuff. But the roofing metal comes in big rolls, I think. And
Yeah, I think they're larger than these.
Yeah, you'd have to cut them with shears and
Right.
cut your hands to ribbons while you're doing it. And yeah, no, too hazardous. And then you'd have to flatten it out some way. And I find that
Right.
very difficult. Yeah.
I don't think he did it very long, but he did it for a while.
Here's another question. Lois, do you feel like you were reacting to some of the people that, Bill was speaking about, Pollock or that generation of piling on paint to just see how much paint can be on a surface?
No, you mean because I'm stingy with paint? No, I'm not reacting to them. I love their paintings. And I certainly looked up to that whole generation of painters. And, it's just that I'm a different person, and you finally recognize who you are, and you pursue that, no matter what else is going on. So, I mean, I'm sure I was influenced by the abstract expressionists, and because they were the big influence of my young generation. But then you begin to look at other kinds of American painting. And I don't suppose I ever, I used to look at Italian painting. What's his name, with the wonderful landscapes? Bill, who do I mean? You know who I mean? Italian landscape, modern.
Morandi?
Huh?
Morandi?
Morandi, exactly. Morandi work was a big influence. No, I mean, I look at a lot, and a lot of it is terrific. So you pick and choose and look at everything is my advice. If anybody needs advice, that is, yeah.
It's interesting how Ryder, to what Christina, you were saying about the big, huge machine paintings and the panoramas, like Ryder, he works on that small scale. Like he makes that choice too.
So there are a couple more questions in the chat. One is, did Ryder lose his eyesight? It was never diagnosed, but I'm pretty sure he had adult onset diabetes, and he increasingly complained about having problems with his eyes or pain in his eyes, or he couldn't work today because his eyes were giving him so much trouble. I don't know that he ever really went blind, but he clearly had a lot of vision issues late in life, especially he had a very bad bout of illness in 1905. And after 1912, he really was compromised by something, whether it was, he may have died of liver disease, so we're not sure what. But yes, his eyesight declined. It made it hard for him to finish pictures. So after roughly 1904 or 5, he would sometimes work on the same painting for years and years and years and still never finish it. It gave birth to the idea that he was sort of a simple soul, kind of naive, kind of a little dementia. And that's when the forgeries started. So there's a question, why were there so many Ryder forgeries? People knew he was hugely famous. He had a very small output, probably only 160 paintings by Ryder in his entire career. There really were very few to have on the market. They were sought after. As Bill pointed out, he was lionized at the Armory show. All the modernists really revered him. So Hartley and Dove and everybody in that generation thought he was super. And so they started proliferating. And actually the people who made a lot of the forgeries were people who claimed to be Ryder's friends.
Yeah.
So Elliot Dangerfield was one. And, the people who, for instance, petitioned the court to get to be his estate executor were actually faking pictures. It's kind of a sad story. It makes you, it kind of destroys your faith in mankind, because a whole lot of so-called friends thought it was easy to make up a few writers and sell them. They were promoted especially by Ryder's first so-called biographer named Frederick Fairchild Sherman, who published a lot of the forgeries intentionally, claiming to be an expert, claiming to authenticate these pictures. And then later, after Lloyd Goodrich got onto him, he had to recant, and he published other articles saying, whoops, I was wrong. I'm sorry, those are not really writers. Because Lloyd was smart as a whip and he figured out what was right. But there was a period in the teens and the 20s when it was terrible. In fact, Pollock was working for the Farragill Gallery in the early 1930s. Oh, yeah. And Farragill Gallery had, they published a book of writers in which possibly of the 202 pictures, maybe 2/3 of them were fakes. Yeah. So for a while, there were many, many more fakes than originals.
Yeah, it's pretty extraordinary. And as of today, it sounds like there might be a newly reattributed writer. So, you know, right. It's still a work in progress. It's still
a work in progress. You know, I still get sent pictures that I've kind of perfected the art of saying this is not characteristic of the work of Ryder as I know it. My way of saying no.
Clement Greenberg was written very well, and he thought highly of Ryder, and he gives him great credit for introducing things that were picked up by later artists. But he talked about the fact of so many fakes, and he said sometimes the fakes are better than Ryder, but they never have the same kind of strength.
Well, he picked up on something that sometimes there is a strangeness or a seeming awkwardness about a writer that as you get to know it better and live with it, you adore. But in the beginning, you go, well, that's kind of strange. And so the fakes never have that. The fakes are always very comfortable. We do have one famous forgery in the exhibition called Norma Hall, coming from the Metropolitan. After Ryder died, museums that didn't already have one went, oh my God, we've got to go get a Ryder. You know, there aren't very many out there and we need one. And so the estate executor went to the Met and did what he did with many other museums. He said, here are 4 paintings from the estate. One of them, you know, these 3 are all attributed to various collectors and have long provenances. This one, however, came out of the estate. It's larger. It's more elaborate. It's a little nicer than the others, but it doesn't have the provenance. And invariably, the museums went for that one. It was always a little cheaper, too. So the Met bought a painting called Norma Hall that is a famous, famous forgery. It was poor Bryson Burroughs who did that. I feel sorry for him. He petitioned the board. He threw his, everything he had on the wire to try to get this painting, which then was a forgery.
We do have a question, I think came in twice about are the paintings that we just showed in the exhibition? And I would say that most of the writers you just saw will be in the exhibition.
I think everything except Moonlit Cove. The last one I think is not, right? The Phillips was not able to lend that for,
And several of the ones Bill showed as well. Some of them are examples like the Pollock, yes. The Benton, I don't think was in the slideshow, but there is one coming.
Right. Right.
Will Jensen. So they're about 20 and 25 and 25, more or less. And the legacy pieces, we're calling them, and the Ryder pieces.
And artists working today that like a whole range of artists work. Is that right?
Yeah, and there are many that were not in the slideshow of the legacy pieces and writers as well that we didn't have time to show tonight, but will be in the exhibition, and many of them are in Bill's chapter in the book. But the writers you saw tonight, except that last one, will all be in the show.
So when will the website be ready for artists to post their own paintings?
That is an excellent question. I don't know if Tina Malat is on the line right now and could answer that, but I would anticipate if you could please check the website in the next couple of weeks. I want to give her a little time to get that uploaded, but
will it be before the exhibition opens?
Yes,
okay.
That's the goal.
Good.
Karen Wilkin is asking how many of the 160 writers are known today?
So most of them, it's really based on Lloyd Goodrich's scholarship. He worked on Ryder for 30 years and he was a masterful scholar. He knew exactly how to trace down provenance and early images and exhibition histories, and he put it together like a giant puzzle. And most of those works that he securely attributed were, over the course of 30 or 40 years, purchased by, in many cases, museums, in a couple of cases, private collectors. There was a collector named Alistair B. Martin, who was passionate for Ryder. He thought he was the greatest painter since Botticelli. And Alistair, accumulated kind of any important Ryder that wasn't snapped up by a museum. So he, for instance, it's his descendants who have near Litchfield. Alistair now has died, but his descendant has near Litchfield. And there's a painting in the show that I adore named Lover's Boat that's from the Smithsonian. That was a gift from Alistair Martin. So there was already, if you had a securely attributed painting that was accepted by Lloyd Goodrich, there was a market for that.
Oh, and I just got a text from the Whaling Museum, Tina Malott, Director of Marketing, that early May. Look at
early May.
Yeah.
Okay, we want all the artists to go post.
Please do.
So are we done here? And maybe we're trying people's patience. Who knows?
There's still quite a few people, but we can. Do we have time maybe for one or two more questions, or we can wrap it up as well if you like.
Someone wants to know what a writer would sell for at auction, and the answer is anything from almost nothing to, if by chance Jonah came on the market, it would be many, many millions. But there are just a handful of great masterworks.
I think this is kind of an interesting question. Has anyone ever tried to recreate what a writer may have looked like when he finished it?
Well, so many of the early works look very similar to what they would have looked like. The early pastoral subjects, the grazing horse, even something like Weir's Orchard, which is a relatively thinly painted work for Ryder. I think that looks very similar to what it would have been in the original. The ones that have changed and darkened are some of the experimental paintings that, the one that breaks my heart is Forest of Arden. Ryder did an enormous number of Shakespearean themes, and most of them have just gone to rack and ruin. There's a beautiful Desdemona that's gone. There's a wonderful Forest of Arden that's gone. He was very Shakespearean. He loved all the stories in Shakespeare, and they did not survive. It's, too much oil. Too thick, too much oil.
And there's been a couple of questions in this regard about did he ever work in plein air, or did he, like Lois, or did he always work from memory or imagination?
He spent a lot of time outside, but he never painted in plein air. He had rooms. He lived for years on 15th Street, and then he moved to the same address on 16th Street. But he was a hoarder. And I've always felt that might have something to do with the way he paints, but he never threw anything away. And so people would describe how you would go to visit him, and there would be a little, what was described as a trail through the hills, where debris was on every side, and a little path to the fire grate and a little path to the easel. And so he just silted up in his environment. And he seemed very content to do it. He wrote in the paragraphs of a recluse, which is quoted in the book. Christina published the whole, all of that, some of Ryder's most extensive writings. He talks about being able to see from his studio window. He has 2 windows, and he can see trees in the courtyard, and they put dappled sunlight across his room, and that he would not trade the view of those trees to live in a castle with an enormous panorama, because the trees and the sunlight and the view that it gives him is so much gratification. So he was, he was a strange guy, but friends kept wanting to clean up the hoarding, and it drove him to distraction.
Yeah.
They would try to come over and say, we'll help you clean it all up. And it would send him into a nervous nightmare. He did not want anyone taking his stuff. I think it's related to his not wanting anyone to take his paintings. He didn't want to give it up. We have a painting in the show called Pegasus Departing that shows the poet on Pegasus leaving the land of the muses. And it's kind of a wrecked surface. It has structural problems. It's kind of blurry. And that's because when the collector came and tried to collect it, Ryder didn't want to give it up. And the collector kept pushing and pushing, and Ryder kept saying, no, no, it's not ready. And the collector said, but my townhouse is opening up. I need it for the salon. And Ryder picked a metal comb up that was on his fire grate and scraped it through the painting surface, destroying the painting, and said, well, I guess it's not ready now. It'll have to be fixed. And I have other things in front of this to do first. So, you know, he didn't want to give things up. He didn't want to let them go.
Well, there's been a lot of comments about how fantastic this lecture has been. So I want to thank you all for joining us, and thank you to all of our audience for, there's clearly a lot to say about Ryder and a lot to be said. So I'll give the last words to our panelists if they'd like to touch on anything else, but thank you.
Sam, can you just put into the Q&A or the chat or something, put my email address in there in case anybody has any questions afterwards about Ryder?
And as well, if you like, Sam.
Yeah.
Okay. We could keep.
Because I know there are questions we didn't get to.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions. I mean, there's, if we want to keep going, we could. It's fine with me.
Well,
I hate to overstay my welcome.
And I do want to remind everyone, you're all very welcome. We are planning an in-person opening on June 24th, and it's the night of the full moon. So we have, and there are all kinds of really interesting programs that are going to be coming out around this too. So please come up to New Bedford and see it for real. We're all dying to see original works of art and not something on a screen. And these pieces are so visceral and so powerful, and the sizes, the scales are just, they're surprising when you see them in person. So, so really we're, you know, Betsy and I've been talking a bit with Bill about this celebration of coming and seeing real things. So please come and be part of this. It's open till October 31st.
Yeah.
And Lois, I hope you're coming up too.
Great restaurant.
How long will this be there? How long will this show be?
It's until October 31st.
October 31st, okay.
It's from the summer solstice to Halloween.
Okay, great. That's a good way to remember it.
Almost the summer solstice, 2 days after.
Yeah.
And the moon rises at like 8:57 at night during the opening. So it should be quite poetic.
Very good.
Thanks, Sam, for organizing us. You did a masterful job.
Thank you. I just quickly typed your email there,
Okay.
Betsy Brown. So if anybody does have questions, they can reach out to her.
Yep.
And Christina, do you have your email? Do you want to just put it in the chat really quick?
Oh, sure.
Or
Yeah.
it'd be a little faster than me. So just hold on a second, everyone. Maybe we could, there was a question about Ryder's relationship with his brother, and there was a hotel.
Yeah, that story, there was a hotel run by his brother, and it was on, I think, 12th Street or 10th Street. It was very close to University. It was like 10th and University or 11th and University, something like that.
Right. Hotel Albert, right?
I'm not actually sure that the Albert is the hotel, and I don't think it was named for Albert Pinkham Ryder. The hotel his brother ran was called the St. Stephen. And but it was in that location, and it's where Robert Louis Stevenson used to come and stay. And so I like to think, because Ryder would go there and take lunch there a lot of days, it's where he got friendly with the waiters. And when one of the waiters lost his life savings at the racetrack, that's the inspiration for the racetrack painting. So I like to think that Ryder maybe met Robert Louis Stevenson at some point when he was taking lunch. You know, when you think about Stevenson's pirate pictures and Ryder's pirate pictures, they have a lot in common.
Very interesting. Okay, well, thank you all. And there you'll see, you see Betsy Brown's email there and Christina Brophy's email. And there's a lot to look forward to at New Bedford and the website for the exhibition. Yeah, thank you all. And it's really fascinating.
Thanks, Sam.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Lois.
Thank you all too.
Okay.
Thank you,
Fun
Lois.
evening, a fun evening.